My name is Mariana Lopez and I work in the autopsy room of a hospital in my city. I prefer not to reveal the name out of respect and privacy. In this field, I have heard many stories about situations that cause fear, bodies that move, speak, or open their eyes. But so far, none of that has happened to me. Even so, what I'm about to share is somehow related to that kind of situation. That night in August 2015, the body of a woman was the first one I worked on. Upon analyzing her condition and examining her internal organs, I quickly suspected that the cause of death might have been some kind of poison. Still, we would need to wait for test results to confirm. After finishing the procedure, I prepared to relax for a bit. As I was taking off my gloves, I noticed something strange. The corpse's fists clenched abruptly and began to tremble, as if containing an intense anger. I felt afraid, but I quickly calmed down, reminding myself that this kind of involuntary muscle movement is common in corpses. Still a bit apprehensive, I hurried to finalize the remaining details. But a strange reflection made me look at the body again. My entire body shivered when I realized that suddenly the corpse was now exuding a strong scent of perfume. And it was clearly a masculine fragrance, something that hadn't been present before. I rushed out, overcome with fear. I went to find my colleagues but couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened. Even so, my nervousness was obvious. My hands trembled, betraying my fright. But despite their questions about what had occurred, I didn't tell anyone anything. I continued working on another body that night, and then occupied myself with other tasks. I was almost recovering from the experience when I was informed about a third body to be processed that night. That of a man who had died hours earlier, supposedly of a heart attack. When I approached where he was, I felt as though I might have a heart attack myself. The same masculine perfume filled the air, emanating from the body, and it was identical to the one that had suddenly appeared on the woman's body earlier. That night I witnessed something extraordinary. The man was the husband of the woman I had worked on earlier. He had been at home with relatives, mourning his wife's death while organizing the funeral. At some point he went to his room, and the last words they heard from him before he collapsed from the heart attack were a scream saying that his wife had appeared to him. If her death was indeed caused by poisoning, as I suspected, the only suspect would have been her husband, now also deceased. Perhaps my story isn't the scariest, but it was a paranormal experience that I lived through, and I hope it sparked your curiosity. Good evening. I currently work at a private clinic in the state of Mexico, but the story I want to share happened during my time in the state of Hidalgo, around the year 1998. Out of respect for the person to whom I owe this experience, I will only mention his first name. My career began at a little-known hospital. I was the typical newly graduated doctor, eager and nervous, waiting for the moment to perform my first official autopsy. I had done it during practical lessons, but as a real doctor, not yet. As soon as I started, I was guided by Dr. Miguel, a veteran professional assigned to mentor me. He was admired by everyone, modest in his manner and always very cordial. His colleagues were proud to work alongside him. Perhaps because I was new or because of my evident inexperience, he decided to closely accompany me. Every time a body arrived, he would call me to teach me the procedures. He was, without a doubt, my mentor. With great patience and detail, he explained each step before I performed it. I remember clearly when he said I reminded him of his early days as a doctor. His eyes would fill with emotion, something he masked with a warm smile. One night, while we were working in the morgue on a body, he mentioned that he might take a vacation soon. Although he didn't have a specific date yet, he seemed relieved by the idea of the rest ahead. I congratulated him on the well-deserved break while performing the autopsy. I asked if he had already chosen where he would go, but he didn't respond immediately. When I looked at him, his eyes were lost, fixed on some distant point, with a smile that hinted at old memories. After a moment of reflection, he told me he hadn't decided on a destination yet. Then I asked when he planned to return, and his answer left a weight on my heart. He said he wouldn't come back, as he believed I would be the future professional to take his place. A few nights later, I was informed that Dr. Miguel would be taking some time off, and during that period, another doctor would be by my side while we awaited his return. I tried to get more information, but I was advised not to bother him. The doctor who replaced him was also an exceptional person, but I longed for my mentor's presence, especially as I would soon begin doing solo shifts, and I wanted him to be with me on my last night as an apprentice. The day arrived, but Dr. Miguel did not return. The other doctor congratulated me, saying it would be the last night he accompanied me. He gave me some advice on how to develop on my own, and then suggested we start working on a body that had just arrived. I accepted the task gladly. Once in the morgue, he pointed out the body and then left. As soon as I began the procedure, Dr. Miguel entered the room. I was surprised, but he didn't allow me to greet him as usual. He simply asked me to continue, explaining that he had only come to accompany me on my last night of training. I was happy to see him, as his presence always gave me a sense of security, especially with the responsibility I would begin to assume the next day. I was almost finishing the procedure when the doctor said his goodbyes. I believe no more than 5 minutes had passed when another doctor came into the room to give me the most devastating news I've ever received. Dr. Miguel had passed away. No one believed the story I told, but he had died hours before appearing there with me. To this day, I consider that the most touching farewell I've ever had. I truly spent one last moment with him, but in a way I could never have imagined. After that, I performed his autopsy, and incredibly, as I worked, I noticed that his lips were curved in a slight, warm smile. My name is Laura Hernandez, and I lived this experience in the city of Coruña, Galicia, Spain. Today I will share something that happened to me some time ago at my job, a profession that is quite uncommon and that for many carries a dark mystery. I've been working for a few months as a mortuary technician, which involves performing a range of procedures on lifeless bodies. This includes everything from cleaning, preserving, embalming to restoration, reconstruction, and aesthetic care, all with the goal of preparing the body for its final presentation. The place where I work is in a hospital a few kilometers from my house, about 20 minutes by car. The mortuary room has everything I need to work after the autopsy has been completed. I don't have a fixed schedule. I am called whenever someone dies, and I am informed of what procedures will be necessary, usually according to the family's requests. This means I can be called both during the day and at night. What I'm about to tell you marked me deeply. It was a traumatic experience, and I know I will never forget it. I can't find any explanation for what I lived through. It all began on a cloudy day. I was at home, relaxing while watching a horror movie. I'm a huge fan of this genre, and I'm always interested in the supernatural, though I remain respectful when dealing with these themes. Suddenly my phone rang. It was my boss letting me know that that very night I would need to prepare a body that had not yet been claimed by anyone. Of course I accepted as usual, and started getting ready. I put on my black shirt, jeans, and the funeral home jacket I wore every day. I remember that on that day I felt strangely apathetic. I didn't feel like moving, and a heavy pressure seemed to weigh down on my shoulders. Time seemed to drag on, and I felt quite down, almost without appetite. My stomach hurt, and the last thing I wanted was to eat. This sensation often came when something bad was about to happen. When I was a child, whenever my father was about to come home, I won't go into details, but he was a horrible person, my stomach would start to hurt, contracting painfully. But this time, there was something else. That pressure on my shoulders that I couldn't explain. When night fell, I grabbed my things and headed to the hospital. While driving, I felt a strange fear, as if something or someone was following me. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just my nerves about having to go out in the dark. I've always been very afraid of the dark. Crazy thoughts crossed my mind. I imagined walking alone through the corridors of the morgue in the middle of the night, surrounded only by the dead bodies. On top of that, I still had to organize the paperwork for that unclaimed body. Just thinking about it already felt like a real nightmare. As I got closer to the hospital, I tried calling the coroner responsible for the autopsies several times, but he didn't answer. I found it strange, as he was supposed to be the one to hand me all the documentation for the deceased. With each passing minute, I became more nervous. When I parked in the usual spot, I felt a chill run down my spine, leaving me completely covered in goosebumps. I kept trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down before getting out of the car, convinced that nothing strange would happen. However, the discomfort persisted. My entire body ached, and that strange pressure on my shoulders remained heavy and bothersome. I quickly got out of the car and headed straight for the back door of the hospital. I went in and made my way to the women's locker room on the left. Fortunately, the place was empty. I took the opportunity to change, stored my belongings in the locker, and washed my face, which brought me some calm. Then, I continued on my way. I passed through the emergency room to take a quick look. The hospital seemed even colder and more deserted than usual. I walked through the endless white corridors that led me to the morgue. When I arrived at my room, I put on the standard hospital attire over my clothes, gown, cap, gloves, and mask. I grabbed the funeral paperwork that was on the table as usual. The instructions said that after preparing the body, I should place it in the coffin. Additionally, it requested that I only perform the basic preservation procedures, as it was for a woman who hadn't been claimed and had no identification documents. With the papers in hand, I left the room. Right next door was the entrance to the main autopsy and mortuary room. As I went to open the door, a shiver ran through my entire body. I began taking deep breaths, trying to control the trembling. Now I know that was a premonition. My body was warning me that something was out of the ordinary. Cautiously, I slowly closed the door and went to look for the coroner's paperwork. They were on the table as usual. When I looked at the papers, there was very little information. The space reserved for the person's name was crossed out, as if someone had written something and then erased it. The same was true for the age and date of birth. I was deeply intrigued, unable to understand what might be going on. I had known Miguel, the coroner, for a long time, and I knew he would never act this way. He was always extremely respectful of people's identities. Suddenly, I started to feel unwell. That feeling that something was wrong took hold of me. Deep down, I knew something strange was happening. I called security and asked about Miguel. They told me they had seen him earlier bringing a woman's body to the morgue, but after that they hadn't seen him again. I found it strange, but I thought he might be in the bathroom or perhaps helping in the emergency room. I decided to start searching among the refrigerated chambers for the deceased woman I was supposed to prepare. However, to my surprise, I couldn't find her anywhere. I had already checked more than half of the refrigerators, and there was still no sign of the body. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise coming from one of the doors, specifically from the last column. This only heightened my nerves. I left the room to see if I could find someone. It had happened before that a staff member got scared when they saw me walking through the dark corridors. But just as I opened the door, I heard one of the refrigerators opening. My heart raced, as these doors weren't supposed to open on their own. They had a security system to prevent that. I carefully observed the door that was open, but I didn't approach immediately. From a distance, I couldn't see anything. I had to get closer, and when I looked inside, I saw that there was no body. What I found was a bracelet made of black beads with a golden initial engraved on it. I quickly closed the door and tried not to give in to panic. I put the bracelet in my pocket and continued the search for the woman I was supposed to prepare for the wake. I looked at the papers again and realized that the indicated chamber was number 32. It was impossible. In that chamber, I had only found the bracelet, no body. I decided to keep searching and try to understand what was happening with the missing body. When I tried to open the left door of chamber 032, I felt that it was heavier than usual, which indicated that there was a body inside. I thought it was the mysterious woman, but I was wrong. What I saw marked me deeply. Lying there, lifeless, was Miguel, with his hands crossed over his chest, wearing his hospital clothes. In his hands, he held a black stone ring with the same gold initial I had seen on the bracelet. I panicked at the scene. I immediately called security and some hospital colleagues. No one could explain Miguel's death, nor the whereabouts of the missing woman's body. To this day, this case remains unexplained. We tried to understand what happened, but no one can give a logical answer. A few days later, we all attended Miguel's funeral. We said our farewells with sorrow, and everyone went on with their lives. The next day, my phone rang. I was informed that I was to prepare the body of an elderly woman in the morgue. As usual, I went to fulfill my duties as a mortuary technician, but when I arrived, I encountered an even more disturbing scene. I picked up the papers and noticed that once again, the information had been crossed out. I went to the chamber where the body was supposed to be, and to my horror, there lay the old woman. A chill ran down my spine. On her wrist was the same bracelet and the ring I had found before. The most terrifying thing was the macabre smile etched on her face, a sight that will be burned into my memory forever. I can't explain what happened. I don't understand the connection between this woman and Miguel. Something dark is behind all of this, something I will continue to try to uncover, because I am absolutely certain that this woman was a witch. Between 1999 and 2004, I worked in the morgue of a clinic in the city where I was born. I moved when I got married. I could spend hours telling chilling stories surrounding this profession, all lived by people I know, some even happening at the local hospital. But in my case, I have one in particular to share. This one, I experienced myself. No one told me about it. I felt the pure terror that one feels when going through something like this. Pay attention, this is no joke. It happened to me one night, and who knows, tomorrow it could happen to you. That afternoon, as I passed through the central office, the secretary called me over and pointed to the phone. She said it was an urgent call. I thought it was my boyfriend, but to my surprise, it was my boss, or rather, the owner of the entire clinic. But before continuing, let me give you a brief introduction. Mr. Don Fernando was the owner of the establishment. He only appeared there occasionally. Few people had the luck of speaking to him for more than a minute, as he wasn't much of a talker. However, not only did I have that luck, but I also became his favorite. After 6 months working there, everyone already treated me as if I were a daughter to Don Fernando. I was just starting my career, and this, I imagine, caused some discomfort in others, if not envy. However, I didn't care. Being the right hand of a magnate was quite a feeling. Until that afternoon when he made a request that completely unsettled me. With a firm and direct voice, he informed me that in about an hour, the body of a child would be brought to the clinic. He asked that I please place it in one of the morgue refrigerators until someone came to pick it up later. Surely, you must be thinking of something illegal upon hearing this. Don't worry, that's exactly what crossed my mind too. Receiving bodies at the last minute was common practice, but we had never been instructed to store one until it was collected. That was definitely out of the ordinary. However, it was his words that followed that made me freeze. He gave me a dark warning. This time his tone was pompous and rude. He ordered that no one should approach the morgue while the body was there unless absolutely necessary, and preferably I should be the only one to handle it. The call ended with him informing me that the vehicle would arrive shortly. I hung up the phone, still feeling a chill running down my spine. My colleagues, who were nearby, looked at me anxiously, as if expecting me to share what he had said. I partially obeyed the order and replied, "They are bringing a child, but I must handle it alone. I hope you understand." I think the shock on my face was obvious. No one believed this was something normal. Even so, no one dared to comment. But when the body arrived, everyone who could peek did so to see the guest of honor. We were all stunned to see a private truck pull into the place. The men got out of the vehicle, opened the back door and lowered a stretcher covered by a black sheet with the body underneath. As usual, I remained composed, but upon seeing a woman silently crying, I felt my heart break. Without a doubt, it was the mother. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and the long black dress she wore reflected her deep mourning. The same men helped me carry the body to the morgue while the woman remained motionless, shedding tears endlessly. Alone with the boy, I looked at him more closely. He appeared to be around 5 years old. Judging by his condition, I assumed he had drowned. His skin was purplish and slightly swollen. The death was recent, and it was evident that he had been a healthy child. I couldn't help but think about how cruel life can be, taking such an innocent being while the chaos of the world continues, caused by others. Before placing the body in the refrigerator, I wanted to say a prayer. That's when I heard that eerie wailing. The crying was of a woman, and it seemed very close to the room. I thought it was the boy's mother, and concerned, I wanted to go help her. When I opened the door, I found one of my colleagues standing almost motionless. The first thing he did was ask if I had heard it too, referring to the crying. I said yes, and explained about the boy's mother, whom I had seen in the parking lot. Surely she had come into the clinic and we needed to console her. But my colleague grabbed me to say something that marked the beginning of the true horror. He mentioned that he had heard the crying inside the morgue, and that's why he had come. At that very moment, the wailing sounded so loudly that I felt my insides freeze. That's when I realized my colleague was right. But that was impossible because there was no one else there besides us. Frightened, I tried to leave, but suddenly the crying echoed right behind my colleague, causing him, terrified, to run back inside. The doors slammed shut and my colleague's face began to lose color. As we desperately tried to get out of there, the crying echoed again. This time it was so anguished and full of pain that it left us paralyzed. It was as if my soul was being torn from my body. I don't know if I will ever find the right words to describe what I felt during those minutes. Being trapped there was already difficult to bear, but what truly tormented me were those terrifying wails that pierced my ears. They weren't just cries, they were screams. Screams of a woman suffering from an indescribable pain, as if her very life was being torn apart. It was like living through a hellish nightmare. My colleague covered his ears, leaning against the wall. At one point his eyes widened, fixed on a point. When I looked in the same direction, I saw the woman from the parking lot. I don't know if the first time she looked different or if I just hadn't paid attention. Her face was bruised, like that of a corpse. Her eyes were red, as if she had cried for hours without rest. Her hands were just skin and bone. The only thing that seemed alive about her was her long black dress, whose ends floated lightly above the ground, as if she were suspended in the air. She was a specter. There was no other way to describe her. For a brief moment, the wailing stopped as she looked at the boy lying on the metal table. The woman approached and caressed his forehead. Then, she raised her eyes to the sky and let out that deafening scream again, as if crying out to the heavens for the cruel tragedy that had befallen her son. An inexplicable cold ran through the entire place before the apparition vanished before our very eyes. The door opened by itself. My colleague finally managed to move, and I felt as if I had come back to life. When it was all over, we left the room still trying to process what we had just experienced. I remember seeing my colleague looking around, dazed, as if he still hadn't grasped the reality of what had just happened. A nurse found us in that state, walking down the hall, and promptly took us to where the other colleagues were, where we were tended to. However, the most unbelievable thing was that no one, absolutely no one else, heard the wailing. When they came to pick up the boy's body, I asked the men about the woman, but they assured me they hadn't brought anyone else. That night, Don Fernando came to the clinic, and I didn't miss the chance to ask who that boy was and why my colleague and I had seen that apparition. His answer was the most chilling part of the whole story. Don Fernando had no idea who the woman I described was, but he knew the boy. He was from a wealthy family, longtime friends. The boy's mother was still alive but had completely lost her sanity. Her husband was afraid that during the wake she would try something drastic. That's why he had asked to keep the body at the clinic until they could ensure his wife wouldn't do anything crazy. The reason? She had been telling everyone that she could hear La Llorona and claimed that she would never allow that figure to take her son. Even today, the woman believes the boy is still alive. A truly insane story. Although my colleague and I have since changed jobs from time to time, we still hear that terrifying wailing, especially when we handle the body of a child. And more, we both have children now, and the fear that the Morgue's La Llorona might one day want to take them is something that sometimes invades and haunts us. I hope you enjoyed this story. But before we move on to the last one, if you're still here, leave a comment sharing your opinion about today's stories. If you prefer, mention the time you're watching. Well, let's continue. I have been working as a police officer since 2003, and in my early years of service, I had a paranormal experience that I want to share today. I don't know if this story will reach another fellow officer, but if it does, I'm sure they'll understand perfectly what I mean. We, in this profession, are quite susceptible to encountering situations that are out of the ordinary. Let me introduce myself. I'm Javier Ortega from the state of Mexico. The story I'm going to tell happened in just one night, over the span of 3 hours. It may seem like little time, but it was enough to leave a deep mark on me, one that I've never forgotten. During a patrol in a dangerous area, my partners and I were focused on responding to urgent calls. Lately, we had been dealing with many false alarms, and just that month, more than 20 fellow officers had been robbed by criminals. Sadly, we had already lost 3 colleagues. Even though we were trying to be more cautious than usual, we couldn't ignore the distress call from a young woman who suddenly appeared in our path, practically forcing us to stop. My partners immediately drew their weapons, and I did the same. We remained alert, observing both the woman and the surroundings to assess the situation. We were uncertain whether we should get out of the car or not. However, as soon as we got a closer look at the woman's face, we realized that this was indeed a serious matter. The young woman appeared to be about 20 years old, wearing dirty and worn clothes. She was visibly malnourished, with a frail and almost skeletal body. Her hair was tangled and dirty, and her appearance shocked me deeply. When she asked for help again, I didn't hesitate to get out of the car to assist her. Up close, I was even more shocked. She was in a deplorable state. The smell emanating from her was unbearable, as if she hadn't bathed in a long time. Her breath, strong and nauseating, revealed broken and rotting teeth, which only worsened the unease I felt. The only clear information we could understand was that she had been held captive in the house in front of us, and that there were more people inside. We had no reason to doubt her, as both my colleagues and I had seen her come out of that house. Given her dire state, we quickly mobilized. One colleague called for an ambulance, while another requested backup. Shortly after, the young woman fainted. There was no one else in the streets, just the 4 of us and the mysterious girl. In silence, we approached the house with our weapons ready. The door was slightly ajar, confirming the woman's account that she had just escaped. I remember my stomach churning at the thought of other girls being inside, victims of trafficking or slavery, exploited by the worst kinds of people. 3 of us entered the house while the other stayed with the girl, awaiting reinforcements. The place was completely dark and the lights didn't work. We avoided touching anything. We were still on the ground floor when we heard sobbing. We sharpened our ears, and upon realizing it was a woman, we quickened our pace. We went up a staircase and reached a room where the muffled cries were coming from. With adrenaline rushing, I kicked down the door, prepared for the worst. Inside the room, we found another young woman in as deplorable a state as the first. I almost cried when I saw her. She was in agony, but even so, she was still trying to free herself from the ropes that bound her. There was a gag in her mouth, and when I removed it, she let out a desperate cry. While my partners rescued her, I continued searching the other rooms for more victims. That's when I heard another cry coming from the last room. I entered, shining my flashlight around, but I found no one. The sound echoed again, this time in a disturbing way, as if something was out of the ordinary. My hands were shaking so much that the flashlight slipped and went out. A sense of coldness began to overwhelm me. Every muscle in my body tensed, and my hair stood on end. The sobbing, now even more terrifying, continued. I knew it was a woman. My heart was pounding, almost jumping out of my chest, as my eyes slowly began to make out a female figure pulsating in the corner of the room. When I finally saw her more clearly, I understood who she was. It looked like La Llorona. The description matched exactly what they say about her, except for the dress, which was torn, just like the other girls. Her long black hair reached down to her waist, and even without seeing her face clearly, I knew tears were streaming from her eyes. I couldn't see her lips, but the wailing that filled the room was, without a doubt, hers. The sound felt like it was tearing through my ears. I think I started to faint because my vision began to go white. However, that spectre didn't seem ready to end the terror it was causing me. The same anguished wailing, which had already tormented me, now echoed directly behind me. As the sound overwhelmed me from head to toe, I felt my sanity slipping through my fingers. It was as if I could feel her presence, her cold breath, her hatred, and her malice. Shortly after, I felt my face hit the floor. Darkness and that eerie crying were the last things I remember before losing consciousness. I woke up lying on the asphalt, being treated by a medic. The young women were already on their way to the hospital, and reinforcements were searching every corner of the house. When I felt a little better, one of my colleagues came to ask me what had happened. At that moment, I realized no one had noticed what I had experienced. I told him that nothing strange had happened and that everything was fine. However, I could never forget that disturbing wailing, which still echoes in my mind. A few days later, I learned that the house had been used by criminals to hold victims captive. Fortunately, we managed to rescue those women alive, but even so, we arrived too late in some aspects. One of the victims had been pregnant when she was captured, and due to the torture and malnutrition, she ended up losing the baby. According to the women's account, La Llorona had started appearing in that house since that fateful night, which caused the criminals to abandon the place in fear of the spirit. Of course, this part of the story was dismissed by the authorities, attributed to stress, hunger, and other reasons mentioned by the doctors. However, I know they were telling the truth. I saw and heard La Llorona that night, in the same room where the young woman lost her child. Does La Llorona appear in places where other mothers have lost their children? That's a mystery I'd rather not have to unravel. Still, I hear that the house remains unoccupied because everyone who has tried to live there has felt the presence of a woman walking through the rooms, accompanied by the anguished cries of La Llorona. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted to all future narrations. I post new videos every day here. I hope to see you in the next ones. Now on the screen, I'm going to leave 2 more good videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there.